Good morning. I'm Catherine Newcomer. I am a faculty member in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University. For some years, we have been delighted to be partnering with REI Systems to host these breakfasts, which used to be in person and again will be again soon, to discuss important issues, that is, issues that are important to the grants management community. And we really are happy to have people at all levels of government, as well as nonprofit grantees. We have a very diverse following, and so welcome. We're really glad. I'm sorry we can't provide you with some bagels and coffee and so on, but at least we'll provide you with brain food this morning. It is a natural for us to partner with REI Systems because grants management is an extremely important topic for all of our students. As you all know, I'm speaking to the choir now, you all know this is a huge amount of the federal budget, over $750 billion last I heard, and I'm sure it's higher than that. And it matters. It matters to all levels of government. And so this forum is an opportunity to give people to ask questions and to learn about other grants management at other agencies, to hear from each other, and to literally provide peer support for this very important endeavor. So thank you for being here. And thank you to our panelists today. I'm very excited. I know that they have a lot to bring to the table to share. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jeff Meyer, who's my partner in this at REI Systems, and is always the best questioner and always so curious to ask the questions that some of us may not be able to articulate, but he's right up set in front of her. So thank you very much, Jeff, for doing this again. I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks very much, Kathy. That's so kind of you. I represent REI Systems, and we've been doing these breakfasts for, I think, 6 years now. And as Kathy suggests, the primary purpose is to try and build community so that if someone's facing a challenge in grants management, whether they are a grant making agency or a state that's doing both receiving and making grants, or a local government that's receiving grants, they have a sense of kind of where they can turn to some colleagues who can help them. And I think it's something that's been quite successful. I want to put out a plug now. In about 2 months in March, we're going to present the results of our annual grants management survey. Just as a kind of a hint, in years past, they've been pretty significant. They found that things, for example, such as grantee burden has been increasing. And so that's caused the federal government to make that a priority in the president's management agenda to think about how to reduce grantee burden. There are some other new findings that are coming up this year that I think you all will find very exciting, and I hope you'll join for that. In this same forum in the March timeframe. I also want to say that I'm particularly proud that REI Systems, I think, is partnering with both a number of federal grant-making agencies to improve their grants management processes and technology, and has offered many of those kind of best practice capabilities on a software as a service basis to state and local governments. Most recently, for example, Cook County in Illinois, the state of South Carolina, the state of Minnesota. So we can provide support for grant managers to the extent that they are interested and need support, especially around technology. The reason, no surprise, I think, that we have our esteemed panelists here today is because it's been a big deal. One of the biggest accomplishments of the administration, the Biden-Harris administration in 2021, was getting the infrastructure bill passed. And surprise, surprise, like many different aspects of government, what that means is a lot of the activity at the federal level will be in making grants that can be carried out so that government will take place and take effect, and actions will happen at the local level but be funded and financed by the federal level, consistent with federal policy priorities. And so I wanted to invite folks from the Department of Transportation to come and talk a little bit about how are they going to be doing the grant management with respect to the $1.3 trillion infrastructure bill. And to a certain extent, kind of what challenges do they see, what successes have they had? And so I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Victoria WASSMER, who has been nominated as the Chief Financial Officer for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Victoria has also had experience in a number of other grant-making agencies and financial roles. So she's played a financial officer role, for example, at the Federal Aviation Administration. She has played it at the Millennium Challenge Corporation doing international development. And of course, she's also played not so much a grant role, but actually kind of a budgetary policy planning role at the Office of Management and Budget for a number of years. And like a number of folks in our audience, frankly, Victoria has great experience both inside government and outside government. So she's been a consultant recently up until this most recent nomination and appointment. And joining her is Robin HUTCHESON, who is a Deputy Assistant Secretary, also at the Department of Transportation. She is focused on safety policy. And prior to that, she has actual operating experience where many of you also do, which is at the state and local level, primarily the city of Minneapolis, for example, and Salt Lake City as a transportation director and director of public works, also as a transit planner overseas. So she has some experience in Germany and can bring that experience to that perspective and experience as well. So with that, what we're going to do is generally Victoria and Robin will take over the presentation. We encourage you to submit your questions in the question box. And things that are just really compelling and urgent, you can also use the little hand raise feature. I'll be monitoring that all along as we go, and if there are questions I can answer, I will do that. If there's a question that's really pressing, we'll raise it, then Victoria or Robin may try and answer it in real time. Otherwise, they'll reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes of this discussion for answering your questions directly. And if there's something that you think is really important that you be able to articulate, we can unmute you and you can ask the question directly. But I will try and see if, for example, 2 or 3 folks have the same question. I may try and consolidate them and raise those to Victoria and Robin to answer. With that, let me thank again Victoria and Robin for coming and offering the presentation, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having us here today. I think I'm going to kick us off and talk for a few minutes and share this virtual stage with my colleague, Victoria WASSMER. I'm Robin HUTCHESON, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety Policy. I really appreciate the introduction and going back into my bio a little bit. I think I'm talking to some kindred spirits here from local government, and it's really nice to be here today. I'm going to start with some foundational information. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The bipartisan infrastructure law is rooted in policy, and that policy is set by the Biden-Harris administration priorities. The money that is available for potential recipients, grant recipients, is all to support, and you can go to the next slide, some very foundational and key priorities. So the first is COVID recovery. And while it may not seem related, everything we do in investment and job creation is also about recovering from COVID. We're still in response on COVID, but we are also looking to recovery. 2 is climate. We'll talk a little bit about what's in the bipartisan infrastructure law to support climate investment, investing in clean energy, job growth. This is a jobs bipartisan infrastructure law. It will create thousands and thousands of jobs, and equity through specifically a Justice 40 initiative, which is under an executive order with the goal of delivering 40% of the overall benefits of federal investment to underserved and disadvantaged communities. Everything that comes in the way of grant applications should be consistent with these priorities and policy objectives of our Biden-Harris administration. Can you go to the next slide? There are numerous agencies that have additional financial resources to help build communities in a more equitable and climate response way. But here at USDOT, we actually have the majority of the funds, which creates an amazing opportunity to reach our mission, which is to ensure our nation has the safest, most equitable, reliable, and modern transportation system in the world. To increase our economic strength, improve our climate outcomes, and build global competitiveness for the American people. Every program that we have at our fingertips is an opportunity to make good on this mission for the U.S. Department of Transportation. And you can go to the next slide. So a little bit more about the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Victoria, who is a compendium of information here. So I will turn it to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Robin. As we had gotten an initial view of folks who had registered for this conference, we did have a sense that there was a number of state and local folks that were participating in the grants management breakfast. And I think we have a polling question that I just would ask if Ashley can launch, just to try and see who's in the audience with us. If you could just select that, and we'll try and tailor some of this so that we can be responsive. And I think at the end of the sort of remarks that we're going to give, we're going to have some questions for you. But if you could please describe what best represents your current industry of where you're coming from and why you're participating. If you're a federal government partner, state and local, a government contractor, nonprofit, or other. Thank you for that. And then I'm going to go to the next slide just to be able to give you a broad overview that is of what's in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we will also post in the chat the interactive Tableau link that is at the DOT budget site that has this information, and you can drill down into it as you are interested. We'll also go over some high-level aspects of what is in the bill, and likewise some of the major programs, which really is the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do. Back to the comment that Jeff made at the beginning, that these are federal resources that are getting allocated out in order to be able to do the type of recovery that Robin is discussing, and to do it in an equitable way that's incorporating climate into the transportation agenda up front and center. So big picture, this is over $660 billion for the Department of Transportation. Obviously, there are other federal agencies and departments that also received funding within the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we're going to be really zeroing in on what's within the Department of Transportation, because that's the area that we're responsible for implementing. But there is a very interactive space where we're coming together as departments and federal agencies to ensure that we're doing this in a collective way as well. If we go to the next slide, just to give you some high-level pieces associated with what is in that $660 billion for the Department of Transportation. These are authorized resources, and it encompasses what traditionally has been a surface reauthorization, which typically is a 4 to 5 year authorization for our major surface transportation modes. That's the Federal Highway Administration, a large part of the Federal Transit Administration, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, as well as Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. But it does more than that. In fact, it actually expands the existing programs, adds new programs, and in addition, funds other parts of our transportation system that typically wouldn't have been in a surface reauthorization, and that includes aviation, that includes maritime resources for ports, and it includes pipeline hazardous material. So we also have, I think, the largest investment in our rail infrastructure ever since the creation of Amtrak. If you go to the next slide, I'm just going to highlight a couple of the major discretionary and formula programs. Announced earlier, actually on Friday, the Bridge Formula Program. That is really significant, $28 billion. In addition, there's over $16 billion associated with investments for bridges that is going to be a competitive program. We also have $5 billion in guaranteed competitive formula funds for electric vehicles, $2.5 billion for charging and fueling infrastructure grants. This again goes towards how are we doing that conversion into a cleaner fuel economy. We have $8.7 billion in formula and competitive protect grants. This is to help on resiliency, to have planning activities that will enable communities to assess vulnerabilities to current and future weather events and natural disasters and changing conditions, including sea level rise, and to ensure that they're planning transportation improvements and emergency response activities to address those vulnerabilities. There's $400 million to reduce truck emissions at port facilities in competitive grants. And we believe that this will help to reduce related emissions from idling trucks and improve the infrastructure overall within the port environment. There's $6 billion for Safe Streets for All. In fact, Robin will talk a little bit more deeply in a moment about all of the things that are in the bill related to safety. $15 billion for mega projects under our National Infrastructure Investment Program, and $15 billion in our local and regional project assistance RAISE grants, which in fact we announced sort of the initial activity last Friday with the intent to put out the notice of funding opportunity before the end of the month. Moving on, just to highlight some of the other areas, if we go on to the next slide, we have $39 billion in public transit, the largest investment in transit in American history. $66 billion, as I mentioned, on passenger and freight rail, which is again the largest investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak. And $17 billion for port and waterways, along with $25 billion for airports to address repair and maintenance backlogs and to reduce congestion and emissions. I'm going to now just talk a little bit about the next program, which is $1 billion associated with the first program dedicated to reconnecting communities that have been divided by transportation infrastructure. We have seen really poignant examples as our secretary has been traveling around the country and meeting with local communities as they've talked about how those investments are and what they mean to them. Likewise, there are a huge host of formula funds that can also be obviously utilized for things that are in state transportation project networks. Now going to turn it over to Robin.
And we could go to the next slide, please. In my experience in state and local government, specifically in local government, we have felt challenged to address the safety challenges on our nation's roadways. It's a crisis. We've seen more deaths and serious injuries on roadways in the last 10 years than we have in the previous several decades. There are disproportionate, and it's getting worse. We're projecting an 18% increase in the number of fatalities for this year alone. There are disproportionate impacts on who is most affected by roadway safety, with disproportionate impacts on people of color, Native Americans suffering the most disproportionate impacts of 3 to 1. And also people walking and biking are most vulnerable roadway users, which are also the key. These people who make choices away from single occupant vehicles are also the key to climate response. So we pursued this hard, and it was one of the best examples of bipartisanship, that roadway safety be elevated in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I think we're all very pleased in a very bipartisan way on the resources that are now available to address safety. So there's actually more than 13 billion total overall, but there's 13 billion in additional funds that didn't exist before to address roadway safety. So 13 is total on top of a FAST Act top line, but the newest one, the one that's garnering the most attention, especially from local government, is the $6 billion for a Safe Streets for All program. There has historically been resources at the state level that sometimes support also local government. This is a companion piece to that, in that any subdivision of a state is eligible to apply for this discretionary grant opportunity. It's divided into 2 sections. First is funding for planning. Many communities would like to understand better using data where their biggest safety issues are. 40% of the funding is for planning efforts. 60% is for implementation and construction of safer streets and roadways. We're working furiously on this right now. It's a brand new program. We have to develop criteria and administrative the administrative backdrop for it. And we're very hopeful that this will move more quickly through the spring and early summer. That's not all. States need more resources too. So there's an additional approximately $3 billion added to the Highway Safety Improvement Program so that states can address their biggest safety issues on the state highway system. And then in addition to that, there's about $4 billion for improved data collection in NHTSA, for vehicle safety programs, and also for truck safety programs. So all told, this is the largest investment in safety in our roadways that we've seen. And this will undoubtedly make a difference. We can't do this alone. In addition to making these funds available, we are also calling on all of our partners to address roadway safety as the crisis that it is. So it's worth highlighting this. I do this in every presentation, and it's expected from me as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety Policy that I will lift this up every time. But it is something that I would love to have the attention of those who are on this breakfast call and interested in partnering with us on these issues. And we can go to the next slide.
A question that seems timely, which is, these sound like great priorities. How can a state or a local entity find out about the opportunity and maybe to submit a proposal? Is the answer easy, like grants.gov, or is there some other answer?
I think my next slides will help answer those questions. Victoria, were you gonna add?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the outreach and resources that are available now, and obviously grants.gov it will flow there, but we're also doing some proactive things already, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that outreach, some of the fact sheets and other things that are on the both DOT website and the things that the White House actually are posting as well.
So we are moving to implementation, and the question is timely and good. There is a tremendous amount of information that we need to push out and make sure that there is an awareness of the opportunities. There's some challenges here that we are working through. So one is that new discretionary grants will bring significant resources to communities. That's an opportunity. Two, there's varying levels of readiness. That's both a challenge and an opportunity. Three, we know that many have access to the system. They know grants.gov, they know how to find information. Perhaps they've applied and received funds before. These communities, cities, towns, counties, states will likely be better poised to find information in a timely way and be ready to submit. That brings us to a focus on underserved cities, towns, and counties and tribes who may not have the same level of access and readiness. We need extra effort in this area to bring them to the table so that the opportunities are available for those who may need it most. And you can go to the next slide. So here's what we've heard so far in conversations. Our intergovernmental affairs team they are out doing, I think it's nearly every day. They've got some kind of engagement to help spread and share information, and they're soliciting information back. Which is why, as Victoria mentioned, we're going to ask you some questions today, and perhaps it's a little unconventional for when we're supposed to be presenting to you, but we are definitely asking for information and feedback so that we know what to push back out that will help you best. So here's some things that we've heard so far. So better communication, clear lines of communication. How do we find information? We've heard that we need to ask you questions. Solicit input in advance of new documents. That's why we're going to ask you questions today. Creating funnels to route certain types of inquiries to specific response teams. We're working on that. We're not done yet, but we are working on that. We heard that from local government that we should be trying to time NOFOs and grant awards with state and local budget cycles as much as we possibly can. We heard that it would be helpful for you, I say you very generally, for us to create common NOFOs or syncing NOFOs together so that they're timed. And then we've heard that there's a desire for us to harmonize federal programs so that funding from separate federal offices can be utilized together. And just one more slide on this, just sharing a little bit more. If you could go to the next slide. Creating technical assistance pathways that are tailored to local government size and capacity. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Creating a one-stop shop on grant information. We are also working on that, so please stay tuned for a helpful tool that will be available to you soon. And then leveraging with our intergovernmental groups between state and local government as clearinghouses for continued information dissemination. We cannot, we need to prepare others to help us share information that I think that will help reach more people. We can go to the next slide. I have not forgotten about the question. The question was, how can we get more information? Where can we get more information? We've got some strategies that we are thinking about and actually starting to act on for expanded technical assistance and capacity building. And that starts with getting better information out. So first, we're building new portals to access information. Not done yet, but getting there, where we will have more of a clearinghouse to find information in addition to grants.gov. This is what we've been calling a front door to the USDOT. As part of that, we know we need to funnel questions to experts that can help answer those questions. Two, we need expanded contact with potential recipients through educational webinars and working with industry partners. Again, we can't be the only ones talking about this, but we can help prepare partners to also talk about this. This is where I mentioned we've had a really good start to this with a set of webinars meant to educate state and local government on various topics. Those will continue for the foreseeable future. Three, we have tools and resources and people now. Our internal capacity is something that we should be leveraging and using to help disseminate information. Every state has an FHWA office. Every region has an FTA regional office. NHTSA has regional offices. FMCSA has regional offices. There are resources around the country that can be helpful starting now. Four, we need to partner with external, either contractors or philanthropic assistance. This helps expand our reach, and this is not a fast setup, but it is something that over time we know will increase our capacity to help you and serve you. And then last, all this feedback we're getting about the NOFOs is really just a request to reduce our administrative burden for potential applicants. And I will say that that is a focus of our work right now, looking at ways we can reduce administrative burden for everyone. That means those people who are on the call today, but also folks who maybe haven't made it to the table yet because of that administrative burden. This is not a month's worth of work here. This is years in the making, and it's just to set some expectations that some things will happen very quickly, like our expanded communication and outreach. Other things will take some time, but be more transformational over time. And I think that is it from me.
Yeah, and I was just going to share on that
Yes.
last part. I mean, this administrative burden, in fact, I think the survey that George Washington does with REI, I think has been really fascinating in terms of thinking about the cost associated with handling the administrative aspects of a grant. And obviously you want more of the resources going to the project and our program that's being funded. And so we're really mindful of that. But we also are mindful of an interest to ensure that we're able to do program evaluation and utilize evidence-based approaches, so that as we go along in this implementation sets of activities, we're able to identify those things that are working and those things that aren't, so that we can fine tune. Many of these things are done on an annual basis, and we'll be able to fine tune our offerings. And so that's a place where we're again wanting to ensure that we partner effectively with others to help to assess the effectiveness of our programs as we move along. And we think that that's sort of a tension that's there, but also important that the things we collect we use. And so that's, I think, something that's front and center for many of the leadership team within DOT.
I just had a last slide of building this engagement machine, which goes straight to the question at hand, and just some examples of what we've done so far and what we're going to continue to do. I think that's it for me now. Back to Victoria.
So we had some questions that we wanted to have as feedback, and I know one of the questions had been, is this presentation going to be shared? Yes, I think it's posted. It'll be shared with the larger group within the next couple of days. But a question that we had for you, as I looked at the sort of survey results, it looks like it's a range of federal, state, and local government contractors and nonprofit and other, but a good percentage are state and local, almost a quarter. And so I wanted to ask this question about how aware were you of what was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law? What challenges do you see for us in terms of implementing, and what information do you think would be most helpful? Just understanding that it again is 5 years of implementation. There are going to be those things that are coming out of the gate straight away, and then those things that will take time. And we want to ensure that we're doing this in a methodical way, and that we're learning as we move along in the implementation activity. So this sort of early engagement is really important for us, and would just love to hear your thoughts, and or if you can post them in the chat, that would be wonderful. Robin, other thoughts there in terms of things that you were hoping to hear? Yeah.
No, I'm really curious to see what comes back in the chat.
So Jeff, handing it over to you to help facilitate this next part of the discussion.
Sure. So I think what Victoria's just asked is, if you have answers to those questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we will kind of try and keep track of that as it goes along. There are a couple or three questions that have come up in the question and answer feature on GoToWebinar also. Let me touch on one of those, a couple of them. And just FYI, from the previous poll, one of the poll results was, or one of the poll questions was, what percentage of folks represent each group in the audience today? About 43% are federal, 23% state and local, 21% government contractor, and 12% are nonprofit or other. So we have a pretty good mix. One of the questions seems to have come from the private sector, which is, we're interested in helping with some of these priorities, the Department of Transportation and this BIL. And we wonder, how can we find people that it would make sense that we would be an attractive team? And I'm to a certain extent kind of wondering whether the questioner meant in proposing for a grant directly from the Department of Transportation, or perhaps in proposing for a sub-grant from, for example, a state that may be receiving money. So what would be the best way if someone thinks they have good expertise, but there may be a new grant recipient or a new aspiring grant recipient? How can they best offer their capabilities to the Department of Transportation or sub-grantees?
So within the federal system, we obviously have, and the majority of this is going to be going out through the FAR rules, and so we will have, I think, an interest in trying to utilize existing GSA vehicles. I know Oasis is one of the ones that we've talked about as a larger community in terms of that as a fairly straightforward way to be able to procure services in this regard. But it's actually really the state and local governments that are going to have the majority of the resources. And in fact, it's something that we're tracking in terms of the benefits that are rolling down to state and locals, and ensuring that they're meeting our equity goals for small disadvantaged business utilization. But that being said, I think that we would want to ensure that they follow the necessary pieces that, again, help to expand those economic opportunities that we're trying to ensure these resources are going to do in local economies, and to do it in an equitable way. So I would say, if you're a contractor, how do you ensure that you're doing that? How do you team effectively? Taking that into account and being able to think about providing a set of service offerings that are really going to get to this generational investment that is going to provide the outcomes that we're wanting to see in terms of reducing things that are in bad repair, putting things in good repair, improving the safety, ensuring access, and doing that conversion to other forms of transportation, which includes transit and in rail, and making our communities ones that can be utilized by multimodal, including bikes and pedestrians and so forth. And I think, for us, safety is really paramount. It's the North Star for the department. So all of that is, I think, really critical as we think about how we design the infrastructure associated with that. And I know Robin can talk at length about the importance of being able to do that, but also I think from the local and state aspect of the private sector opportunity.
So let me ask another question that I'll ask to start with of you, Robin, because it'll kind of relate to safety, but it's more general through our federal audience. Federal government's putting out huge amounts of money in terms of grants and wants to make sure that the program is being carried out, that value is being obtained for that money. And so two things you mentioned. One is improving safety, reducing traffic or pedestrian fatalities. And another is, hey, part of this bill is about jobs. Tell me a little bit, if you can, about thoughts the department might have about how to measure those sorts of things, and maybe especially in ways that are not overly burdensome to some of the grant recipients, that doesn't require they stand out on a street corner with a pencil, perhaps. What ways is DOT thinking about measuring results from these grants?
It's such a good question, and I'll give you some thoughts that should not be construed as exactly what to plan on if you see a no vote. Just some thoughts from me today. One of the hallmarks of, and I'll talk about Safe Streets for All. I'll leave aside jobs for just a moment, but one of the hallmarks of the Safe Streets for All is the use of data to pick projects. Where we're very clear, it's in the legislation that communities should be able to use data to assess their biggest issues. That sets a foundation for each potential recipient to be able to measure against the data that they have used to demonstrate the need. For safety, reducing the number of deaths is a pretty good metric that is valuable for each of the communities. I don't know that that's something that you would see as the federal administrative requirement, but it's very valuable for each community to think of it in terms of that way, starting with using data to set the goals. I don't know yet how we're going to evaluate the administrative you know, how I don't know yet how we're going to ask recipients to demonstrate success. We're still working on the development of the NOFO, but it will be something that gets at the safety problems and the use of data to define problems and measure against the data. But like, that's a really premature statement from me in my thinking without having yet written a NOFO or fleshed it out. On the job creation, that's a pretty easy thing to count up over time. So I would imagine, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but I would imagine that job creation will be tracked very, very carefully across the entire, you know, suite of discretionary grant opportunities.
So
yeah, and with job creation, I think one of the things we are mindful of is, you know, the Council of Economic Advisors has how do you look at induced jobs and so forth. There's a number of areas where we will be looking at that across the economy for all of these investments, not just at the Department of Transportation, but obviously DOT is over half of what's in the bipartisan infrastructure law, so it's an important question for us as well. And I think there's a big emphasis as well in a number of cross-cutting areas, including Made in America and so forth. So that's an important place also of inducement that we're trying to ensure industries take seriously and understand the intent of what we're hoping to be able to achieve.
And I'm just curious, you know, I can imagine two paths. One is you could say, all right, grant recipient, tell us how many jobs were created, at which point they kind of have to count them. It's a little burdensome. Or you could say, you know what, actually the Census Bureau regularly gathers data and we can perhaps get the data indirectly from an electronic source that's less burdensome. Has there been any thought about kind of one or another of those paths?
We've talked about the tension associated with the jobs collection information. In some instances, it's actually a requirement that's within the statute or within the regulation. So we'll have to balance that along with recognizing that in many ways, in order to be able to get to some of the equity outcomes, some of those things are incredibly local.
Yeah. So we have an audience member, Teresa Nick, who has asked, many grants require a short 4 to 6 week turnaround, but these are pretty complex. Some of them are new programs. Would the department consider increasing the deadlines to an 8 to 12 week horizon?
So I think that's something we'll have to take back. I think in some instances there are, you know, 6-month planning cycles for being able to ensure that what's out there in terms of the notice of funding opportunity is helping to lay the groundwork so that there can be that effective partnership. Obviously, existing programs are easier to do that work. New ones are going to be more challenging, but we will make sure to sort of take that point back just in terms of time and appreciate the input.
Sure. And another question, this comes from, let's see, I'm sorry, it comes from Zakir Mahmood, who says, how can small or disadvantaged businesses best support this investment, especially from a governance perspective? And I think to a certain extent, you know, the question you've kind of already answered a little bit is how to apply and kind of what outreach. But in this case, I kind of sense a little bit of part of the question is, hey, you know, some of the disadvantaged communities maybe ought to have a seat at the governance table to help make sure that, you know, things are spread around in ways that are equitable. Can you tell us anything about the governance that's helping promote the equity issues that DOT is prioritizing?
We have, from the beginning, established an equity focus, which is, of course, as Robin laid out at the beginning, one of the you know, foundations of the Biden-Harris administration. And as part of that leadership, we have a series of work streams, including one on economic justice. Our Assistant Secretary, Phil McNamara, for management, as well as our Director of the Office of Small Disadvantaged Business Utilization, Shelby Scales, who is a longtime person who's worked also in the local government arena, thinking about opportunities for small disadvantaged businesses, have been working on a series of things to ensure that we're helping to get at that question. Our Office of Civil Rights, led by Irene Marion, who actually co-chairs the equity leadership team is responsible for helping to ensure that disadvantaged business enterprise utilization, which is a large requirement for the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, as well as the FAA source of funds, are being monitored and utilized. But I would say in terms of helping to provide a voice, there are panels and forums that I know Shelby Scales is running as part of, we call it the OSDBU outreach. And, just her team is very open to having input and ideas. There are a series of things that they've been trying to ensure that they've heard have been impediments in the past for small disadvantaged businesses that they want to help ensure we partner effectively within the federal government with our peers at Department of Labor and Department of Commerce and Small Business Administration, and at the same time, things that we know we can do ourselves.
Great. We have a person asking from a particular perspective, works with community colleges and wants to know whether or not, since there are, a bunch of new grants, and we're trying to focus a little bit on some marginalized and underserved populations, and some of these are kind of job related, is there anything that might be offered to either community colleges or other sorts of educational institutions to help them get people ready to take on some of these new roles? And I, to be honest, don't know whether that's in DOT's portfolio or whether that may be elsewhere, but I thought I would leave it to you all to answer.
Robin, you want to talk about the partnership with Department of Labor?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say that it's not squarely in our portfolio, but if we're successful, we are engaged in it. And so we are partnering, and we'll have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Labor on workforce development. We're going to be in the business of building for the next 5 to 7 years. We need to develop, it's an opportunity to develop the workforce to be able to match the demand. The president was in Minnesota. I was so proud. The president was in Minnesota at Dakota County Technical College, DCTC. And in my past experience, we partnered with the city of Minneapolis partnered with DCTC to train. We would have our employees join us for a year and then go to DCTC to obtain a CDL and get an immediate promotion and be ready to do a whole variety of additional jobs. That particular and many community colleges train for trades as well. This is skilled labor we are going to need. So this partnership with the Department of Labor will ensure that it's not just job creation, it's skills development as well to be able to build the workforce for the future that we're going to build. So we are excited about these opportunities. It's more than just repairing the bridge. These are people's lives and livelihoods that we can build with the bipartisan infrastructure.
Great. So Mike Chamberlain says, how will you be working with the grants QSMO, which is the Quality Assured Services Management Office, to help streamline the grant process, especially for communities that may not have as many resources, may not be familiar? Again, in my words, perhaps they're newbies in terms of some of these grants, or perhaps the last time they dealt with them was many years ago. So the question is, are there any kind of cross-governmental coordination or efforts that you may be working with to try and help manage the burden on grant recipients?
There absolutely are, and we have great relationships in my office in particular, in the Office of the Secretary, Budget and Programs Office. We have been leading the charge with the relationship with the QSMO. I think it's a really important aspect. We've been having frequent conversations associated with the insights that they can provide, what's in the marketplace, and better understanding. Jen Funk, who is our Deputy CFO, routinely meets with them. Likewise, at the OMB Chief Financial Officer Council, there are frequent presentations to look at exactly those kinds of questions associated with burden market opportunity and what the QSMO is doing and discovering. And so we do see that partnership as being really important as we both implement just this large-scale bill, but also think about the systems that are necessary and the improvements to those systems. Taking into account the President's management agenda, which has been launched back in November, and I believe in December there was a whole customer service, customer experience platform that is coming out of the President's management agenda. Robin and I have talked frequently about how do we ensure that the customer experience, which in this instance, I think we're looking as defining, because such a large portion of the bipartisan infrastructure law is through our grant program. We want to ensure that that experience on all sides, again, is one that is improved and streamlined, and one that is effective. And speaking again to this issue around helping to improve the capacity through technical assistance of especially non-traditional grant applicants.
And it may be that some of the folks don't necessarily know all the acronyms and parts of your presentation, but I was pleased and impressed that you're offering kind of presentations and roundtables at the National Association of Governors, the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, and so forth. Are those things that are going to be recorded and perhaps could be made available to wider audiences who aren't able to participate for reasons of geography or timing?
They are already recorded and available, and we'll be sure to send those links to you.
Great, and just so people don't necessarily have to write them down, REI will capture those and make sure you get those along with the slides in this presentation.
That's great.
One of the things that kind of draws a little bit on something Victoria said and a little bit one of our questioners said is, a lot of these may be new grant recipients or new grant seekers. And in my experience with REI, working with quite a lot of different grant managers, one of the biggest concerns they have is compliance. They're afraid of getting their hand slapped or the grant yanked away or perhaps being thrown in jail if they take a wrong step. And so I wonder whether or not, and this may be difficult, but could you offer any thoughts about kind of where are the biggest risks to a new grant recipient associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law? Is there, are there 2 or 3 areas you would say, hey, this is what you need to be most careful of to avoid any sort of compliance problem?
I'm going to ask Victoria to try on that one.
It's a great question. Trying to boil it down to 2 or 3. I know there are often impediments as folks, don't want to have this concept of, being clawed back. And I think one of the key areas that I have to be responsible for is our fiduciary responsibility. So being able to ensure that there's the necessary pieces in place in terms of being able to track the resources, that there's a full understanding around what those resources are intended for, what kind of matching funds you need to be able to provide, and so forth. I think that's one of the reasons why we know for entities that before haven't really come to the Department of Transportation, we want to be able to provide a improved experience for them and support as they engage. And I think it's been something we've been successful with various infrastructure programs in the past that providing sort of coaching and guidance along the way for some of our discretionary program. Our RAISE program is one of those where I think there's been feedback for people who have applied that maybe in one year weren't successful, but in the subsequent years were, because they've been able to get information and advice around how to improve their package. So I think all around, we're trying to ensure that we think about that. But this question, or what the 2 to 3 top things, I think we need to help fine tune that response. Thanks for the question.
If I might suggest, what I found, one of the most popular sessions we had of these ever was when the GAO folks came and said, here are the big risks we found with federal agencies getting caught up in an audit problem, and here are the kind of the biggest and most frequent problems. And the federal audience was really interested in that. In this context, it might be really helpful if you could persuade the Department of Transportation's Office of the Inspector General to say, here are the things we think are most likely to be audit findings. So try and make sure you don't get in trouble in areas A, B, and C, and perhaps include that in some of your public outreach. Because again, a lot of these grant managers, especially the new ones, they kind of lose sleep at night worrying about this stuff. Turning back to the questions from the audience, we had Manarita Ahuja ask, I'm really interested in getting in contact with the Office of Small Disadvantaged Business Utilization, what you've described as the OSDOT. I want to make sure I find the name correctly, is Shelby Scales spelled S-H-E-L-B-Y, S-C-A-L-E-S. So that, and what I would suggest is, again, we try to provide contact information for folks like that you've mentioned as part of our email going out after the fact. Is that something where you can share that name and or email address or any other sorts of contact information?
Yes, we'll make sure that Shelby Skills and her office link is made available. I'm not going to be able to search it right now and not unfortunately get disconnected, so we'll make sure to do that.
Yeah. We've got about 2 minutes left. I want to offer one last question myself and then say again, thanks so much for taking the time and thank you for your service and helping improve infrastructure, create jobs, and improve equity. The last question is, a couple of federal departments are kind of talking about ways that both might improve the efficiency of grant making, which is pretty darn efficient, frankly. Kind of 2 to 5% of grant revenues are spent on grant administration, and that's a lot less than almost any nonprofit, for example, spends. But they're asking about, are there ways we can use something, let's call it, for example, blockchain, to be able to track spending so that our recipients don't have to be so thorough and use so much energy to do the reporting. So are there ways we can kind of short circuit some of the onerous parts of reporting? And is DOT experimenting with anything that might help improve or ease the grant administration effort in that vein?
Well, blockchain is very exciting, but I do think that that's something where we would have to ensure that there was reviews at the top. I think this is a place where Treasury is sort of the leader of how we handle this type of information and flow. But I think the technology is promising. I've seen some examples of where that's being done well. But at the same time, I don't think yet within the federal system we have embarked upon the use of that. But I'm always interested in hearing about how through different forms of automation and technology you can improve the overall experience. So that it is, blockchain I think is interesting, but I don't think we're at a place yet to install that.
Okay. Let me ask if you each have a last 30 seconds worth of comments. One last thing, I just learned that we confirmed the date on March 10th. We will have our next grants management breakfast and we will present the results of the annual grants management survey that we do with a combination of George Washington University, the National Grants Management Association, and REI Systems. So thank you so much again, Victoria and Robin. Any last comments that you'd like to make?
Thanks so much for having us today. The more we share, the more information you have, the better this will go. So thanks for the invitation.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully this was informative, and we really hope to partner with all of you to ensure that we're successful in making a difference for the American people and their travel experience. Thank you.
Thank you all. And this concludes our grants management breakfast. We hope you'll join us again on March 10th.